Tired and hungry.
Have some cheese and crackers.
So I have an apple, Frank, if you'd like.
You do well as hand it over.
I like your background, Chuck.
Appreciate it.
It's South Dakota
Thanks for the
Badlands.
David's supporting the home team.
There you go. I like that, David. You look like you're doing the news.
Rockbridge report.
Got mine too?
Yeah, thanks.
Hey everyone, I'm going live to Facebook now.
Wait a minute.
Hold on, not quite yet.
Hey, who is the Galaxy S10?
I don't see that.
Star Wars.
It's an audio only.
Oh yeah.
Hi.
Here's Michelle. Jake, though.
Yeah, I see that. I don't know.
Janie, are you on? Do you hear that Galaxy X10?
I see it.
I'm here. How many are we? Just the 4 of us right now? 5?
We are all here.
You're all here, and it is 5 o'clock. If everyone's ready to call the meeting to order, we will do so. Janie, from the standpoint, was the Zoom on the city website for people to join?
No, because that was a safety hazard as far as
Hackers.
as far as
Security
hackers
issue?
go. So it's being video recorded. And I'm trying to get it to stream to our Facebook, and it's not wanting to.
Zoom has become very popular for hackers. Yeah.
Well, let's see.
Okay, well, it's being recorded anyways.
Perfect. Good work, Janie. Thank you all for your patience as we navigate this electronic meeting. So we're here for a budget work session, and Janie's going to feed up documents that I think Jim and Gary are going to speak to, and possibly Jake, guide us through on how we're going to get where we might be going next year. And I think I'd sent out the expectations. Jim and Gary and Jake will present some ideas for us to ponder. We'll have an opportunity to discuss those. And then we'll talk about next steps and a consensus from council, what we're willing to accept or work towards. And David, thank you for sending the questions ahead of time. I'm not sure if you got any from anybody else, but certainly welcome questions on this format as well. But I'll bounce past it to Jim and say, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mayor. As you know, we have balanced the budget internally. And I want to say thank you to Gary, Jake, and our leadership team, as well as our community partners and our community organizations that have all been very helpful, come to the table, and really done a great job to get us what we needed to have to close a $900,000 plus gap in our budget. And we did this without a tax increase. We did it without any use of reserves at this point. And the Lexington City Schools budget was not reduced at all. So we did this pretty much all internally to our own operations without harming the things that are most important to us in the community. And with no further comment at this point, I'll have Gary take us through the cuts that have been made and some of the other aspects of the changes in the budget that had to be made to accommodate balancing the budget for us. Gary?
Good afternoon, members of council and any citizens who may be listening. It's certainly been a busy week since we last met with you last Thursday. What I want to take you through is a summary of the changes that we've made in the various funds, both in the revenue projections and in the expenditure projections for each of those funds. And of course, the most significant changes are in the general fund. Let me walk you through first, if I may, the changes in the revenue projections in those local taxes, namely sales tax, meals tax, lodging tax, and depot tax. We have been guided by the estimates given to us by Virginia First City. They think that Lexington's local sales tax will be reduced by 10%. So that leads to almost a $55,000 reduction in the projected revenue from the budget that was presented last week to council. I might note that the sales tax as projected by the state of Virginia was approximately 5% higher than what the amount that had been included in our budget proposal to council. So really, we're really only having to reduce another 5% to get to the total 10% reduction that Virginia First Cities expects. They estimate that our meals, lodging, and business professional licenses for next fiscal year are likely to decline by 25%. So you can see the respective amounts of those decreases, with meals tax being very significant decrease of over $400,000. Furthermore, they estimate that Lexington's real estate tax collection and personal property tax collections may decrease by 5%. Internally, staff had a discussion about that, and we tend to think that 5% reduction is probably overstating the likely reduction in revenue, because we can't see for the full fiscal year next year that many residents not paying their tax bills. So rather than using the 5% reduction as suggested by Virginia First Cities, we're showing half of that reduction, 2.5%. But even so, that still leads to a reduction in collection real estate taxes of a little bit more than $148,000, and an additional $21,000 reduction in personal property tax.
I'd like to interrupt, Gary, and add that the Virginia First Cities model or formula was applied to all Virginia First Cities with these same percentages. And we thought, that's an average. And so in case of the real estate tax, our payments are going to be better than the average of Danville or Norfolk or Richmond. And so we thought we could be a little bit under that average of 5%.
Thank
So
you,
I'm sorry. So the reduction in real estate tax revenues is just some household owners not paying their taxes. Is that correct, Gary?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, because obviously property values, the assessed value will be what it originally was. Now, eventually, when we have the reassessment, depending on what the national economy is, and it could affect the assessed values. But for fiscal year 21, the tax revenues won't be affected by that.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
To piggyback on that, Chuck mentioned homes, but it's also commercial real estate, correct?
That would be, yes, all taxable real estate, both commercial and residential.
Okay.
Thank you.
Gary, in a normal year, when people don't pay their taxes, do you have off the top of your head what that percentage would be in our losses there?
We normally collect, it's pretty close to 99%. It's 98 point some percent
Okay.
on average.
Okay.
So we have a very high collection rate.
Okay.
And in addition to that, whatever is not paid that first year, a significant amount gets paid in subsequent years. So we really don't have that many that we actually end up being totally uncollectible.
Okay.
Hey, can I ask a question? I'm curious about the estimates that VFC came up with. Did they lay out any assumptions they were making to get to those estimates, like whether the stay-at-home orders were going to continue just through May or go on through June? Because that would obviously make a big difference. So I'm just kind of curious if they kind of laid out what assumptions they were making.
I see Gary looking for that, but I believe there were some assumptions that were made. I can't recall that they went into that detail, and I don't have it right in front of me. Gary, are you finding that?
They did have some overall information. They actually went through looking at what percentage of different revenue sources for cities versus counties versus large towns. I guess I had thought this was, or I had thought that perhaps this document had been shared with council, but I guess in further thought, you just referred to it at last Thursday night's meeting.
We got it.
I don't see a great deal of detail on exactly how they went into making their projections and their models.
Well, do you feel comfortable with those estimates? What assumptions are you making to feel comfortable with those estimates, I guess? Like if you think our meals tax and our lodgings tax and our BPOLs are going down 5%, is that based on the stay-at-home?
Let me put it in these terms, Dennis. Let's assume that there were no meals sold for the first 3 months of the fiscal year.
Okay.
That alone would reduce meals tax for the entire year by 25%. Now, we all know that drive-by establishments, such as fast food restaurants, are still in operation, so there won't be a total reduction. How long this stay-at-home order is likely to last, who knows? How many of our restaurants may not survive and therefore won't pay meals tax beyond the time we go back to normal. So I don't have any basis to make a better judgment. We looked at several sources, not only the Virginia First Cities, but there was a study that came out from Old Dominion on what they think is going to happen to the state economy. There have been various sources, and perhaps Jim will want to speak to this a little bit more, but I believe it would be fair to say of all the sources that we've seen to this point that probably the Virginia First Cities maybe had the most dire predictions of any of those sources.
Really? Okay.
But I think the truth would be nobody really knows the real impact at this point.
Yeah.
We're just trying to make best estimates that we can. So
And
I feel comfortable that this is a pretty good estimate. In fact, Virginia First Cities, their projections for FY20 came not all that much off of what we had already internally projected off for our drop-ins, meals, lodging, and sales tax. So at least there seemed to be some concurrence with their numbers for what we already had thought.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
And I will say that they also put together estimates that were specific to this certain types of taxes that are collected. The other estimates we saw didn't break it down by tax type. And so we felt more comfortable using this one because you could see specifically what their recommendations or projections were for each tax type. And that was a little more comforting, if you will, to look at that and understand why they were making those recommendations. As Gary said, do we know that the first quarter of next year we're still going to have a stay-at-home order in place? we don't. How many businesses, though, as Gary said, might be operating? And, you know, are we as Americans going to come back and spend as much the same way we did for the entire fiscal year next year? Probably going to be some reduction. What is that? I don't know.
Got it.
And if I may interject briefly to follow up on Gary, looking through the study, the Virginia First study, a little bit more, it appears that their assumptions are based on a U-shaped recovery, economic recovery beginning this summer 2020. So it would appear that they're basing that upon the governor's current executive order expiring in June as currently dated, and a U-shaped recovery beginning in this summer, in the summer months, and continuing on throughout the remainder of FY21 with a full recovery, it states, not anticipated until fiscal year 2022.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
And I think that all makes sense. Virginia First Cities is, at the end of the day, a lobbying firm. They're taking these projections to Richmond on behalf of their clients to say the federal money that's going to flow to Virginia, it needs to come down to the localities to fill these gaps. So, I mean, that's who Virginia First Cities is, and that's what they're using these figures for.
I'm not arguing with the figures. My concern was, I just wanted to know what the assumptions were. So if you know, things change, we would have a better sense of whether we were going off track, basically.
Fair enough, Gary. Let's plow on through the rest of this document.
Okay, the next line of reduced revenue has to do with city pool, and it is the city manager's recommendation in an abundance of caution that we not operate the city pool this summer to hopefully help stymie the spread of the COVID-19 virus. We had included in our original budget projection $11,000 fees as the profit or membership sharing arrangement with the Y. But if we're not going to operate the pool, which down in the expenditure section, you'll see our assumption for the expense savings, then we would not receive this $11,000 in income at the end of the pool season. The county has given us a revised revenue sharing estimate based upon their projections of reduced local tax collections that they'll be collected. And as you can see, that's a significant reduction, nearly $89,000. Now, the next two small figures are actually increases in reimbursement. Since we prepared the original budget, we've now gotten the exact numbers from the state of Virginia, but they plan to reimburse the city of Lexington through the compensation board for both the commissioner's office and the treasurer. So that's a little bit of a plus in those two items. Now, originally in the budget, we had assumed that we would receive a grant for the entire cost of the school resource officer program. That's the way that that grant has been structured in the past, 100% reimbursement. Since then, we've learned that if we're approved for that grant, then there will be a local match required of $23,448. So we reduced that out of our estimate for grant revenue.
So that's a 50% match. That's half.
No, it's less than a 50% match. It didn't seem to be any even percentage. Mark Rowley said this was the amount that was cited in the grant documentation. So
are you?
It's probably about a 60-40 match, roughly.
So if you're not going to do the match, are we delaying the grant or rejecting the grant, or can we? I don't think we can just hire just the funded part from the grant, correct?
That would be correct. Either we have to leave the school resource officer position in there, which is currently in this revised budget still in there, or if we have, if we're approved for the grant, then if we're not going to add that position, we have to deny or refuse the grant and not accept the revenue, and we wouldn't have the expenditure. So when we come down to options for other expenditure cuts, that'll be one of the options that you see that we've listed. But right now, for the revised budget, we still have that position in there with the majority of the cost being reimbursed by grant, but 23,000 of the cost would have to come from local share.
Can I ask that the reduction in the grant, and remind me again, the grant covers just the first year of the SRO, or is it 2 years? I don't really remember.
My impression at this point in time that it's now just a 1 year. Last year when we were approved for the grant, it would have been a 2-year grant, but apparently more and more communities are requesting the grant, and so the parameters seem to have changed.
I'm just wondering if it's your sense or you guys' sense that, like, that the reduction was COVID related, meaning if we waited a year, maybe it would go back to a 2-year grant or a 1-year full grant. I mean, that would definitely weigh on.
I don't have any sense that there was any change made because of COVID, I believe. We were just under the incorrect impression, when I say we, Jim and I, when it was originally proposed to us. Our understanding from Sam Roman was that it'd be a full grant, but that's not a current impression from
And we do
looking at it more.
And just, I can't remember, do we have the grant, or when do we get the notification about the grant?
I don't believe we've been notified yet whether we're approved or not. Is that correct, Jim?
That's correct. We have not been notified.
But that should be soon, right? Because that's for this coming school year, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. So we should know soon. Okay.
Yes.
All right.
And perhaps I'd be out of line, but I'll go ahead and say it anyway. If we're not approved for the grant, then I think that we've got to seriously consider whether we're going to include this position or not. When we originally put it in the budget, I think Jim and I have the understanding this position is included assuming that we got the grant. So if we don't get the grant, then this topic has to be revisited for sure.
Got it.
Okay.
So we're in I'm sorry. It's hard doing this without being able to see everybody, and so I'll just start speaking. So if we did get the grant, and we don't know exactly when that will be awarded, we'll have to start, I guess, training and advertising. If the position were open, I would say on a fairly short time frame. I'm having some personal reservations on keeping the position regardless of the grant. So that's my 2 cents.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think we shouldn't base a position based on just getting grant funding or not. I think this whole thing points to we need to make sure our IT capabilities are where they at maximum, so we can navigate not only this situation, but I think it shows that in different emergency situations that's an important core function both for the city and for the schools. I'd really be interested if the school system and the city, if we've gone back and looked at that, and I'm a little concerned we have some IT cuts, about if that is still viable.
Before we start debating issues, I'm glad to handle it either way, but my hope is that we can go through all the recommendations and then come back and visit them individually. So I'd say mark by them, and as Gary said, depending upon the outcome of that grant application, revisiting that position, that's been a hot topic for various council members along the way. But let's try and get through the.
Can I just ask one more question related to revenues? So we're not going to see any kind of emergency related funding for COVID? I mean, do we know, Jim?
The only thing that I've seen, and we've looked at this, several of us, is that COVID-related expenses can be applied for reimbursement. But as far as making up revenue losses or paying for any types of our programs or services, I'm not aware of anything coming from the federal government.
Okay, I'm just asking because, sometimes staff, what they're doing can be reassigned, or a portion of what they're doing could be reassigned to those related activities. And then you can charge a part of their salary or wages to that. So that's all I'm asking.
Again, from what I've seen, it's very specific to COVID-19 related expenses. We'd actually having to respond, provide, buy materials, buy equipment, PPE, etc.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to see that much expense. We are tracking what we are doing, but there's not going to be that much to help us in the budget.
Okay, thanks.
And Michelle, you raise a good point, because I think there's been a lot of talk, what the federal government may do to assist localities, but at this point, there's nothing.
Nothing in the pipeline.
Nothing to hang our hat on. That would just help.
Losing signal.
Put in some of the.
Well, I am in here and I'm still.
Not get lost in the mountains.
Okay, Gary, you want to keep moving now?
Okay, I'll do that.
There we go.
Okay, moving on to expenditures in the general fund. It is staff's recommendation that the 3% wage increase that was included in the original budget proposal be delayed for implementation on January 1st of 2021. That would generate a savings, including fringe benefits, of $77,648. There were some other staffing changes, things such as increase in a part-time position in the treasurer's office to full-time. We had originally projected a 3.1% increase for health insurance, as previously reported at the council meeting. That increase came in better than expected at only 1.1%. We had Virginia retirement system. The actual contribution rate was received subsequent to the preparation of the original budget, and unfortunately that increased our cost some, but net, all those other wage and benefit changes will save us $71,325 next year. Through the efforts of all the localities working together on the jail commission along with jail staff, they've made some rather significant cuts to the jail budget, and consequently that decreases Lexington's share of that jail budget by a little bit more than $52,000. The city manager has been working with the Berkeley group, negotiating to reduce their current contract from $200,000 annually to $135,000, saving $65,000 projected for next year's budget. I think that is probably still work in progress, correct, Jim?
We've agreed that this is how we'll approach next year's services. we would still have Arnie on board. And then the other jobs potentially would be on a case-by-case basis, with the comprehensive plan being finished next year, since we're all in the middle of that. I am still negotiating with them and see if they could give us a little more a break on those rates, though, where we are.
How's it going? Hang on 1 second, okay? Sorry. That's okay. Daddy's in a meeting. So he was in a different
Okay.
place, and now he's.
Moving on, we had originally $35,000 in the budget as a contingency amount. Right now, we've reduced that to 0, although at the end of the discussion today, you'll see that if we wanted to, we could put back as much as approximately $11,000 into that contingency. The big savings and reduction is tied to eliminating certain projects out of the capital improvement fund, and we'll give you more detail when we get down to Fund 8 on that. But the way it impacts the general fund is that it would reduce the funding from the general fund to that capital improvement fund by $310,000. There's also a savings in the school fund, even though no cuts were made to the school expenditures. And this will hopefully make a little bit more sense when we get to the school fund. By using the $92,000 anticipated savings for this year, plus the additional amount that the state's notified them that they should expect next year based upon their average daily census, we could reduce the funding, local share funding to schools, $138,172, excuse me. By closing the outdoor pool this summer, our contract with the Y to manage that pool is $36,000. Pool was open for roughly 3 months out of the summer, from Memorial Day to Labor Day. Well, obviously the first part of this summer's season would occur in FY20, so we would expect a third of those savings for the WIPES management fee to occur this year, resulting in a $24,000 savings in fiscal year 21. With the reduced collection of lodging taxes, then our contribution to the Horse Center would be reduced by a little bit more than $44,000. And we're recommending that consideration being given to cutting discretionary agency contribution by 10% and a similar amount for tourism, Main Street. So the tourism, if their board adopts that, which my understanding is from Jim, that Jean Clark's recommending this reduction to her board, I'd say $29,000 next year. Main Street was in the budget at $80,000, so a 10% cut would be $8,000 reduction. And RARO, rather than that being a percentage increase, Rocky Trudgeons reviewed his budget, identified cost savings that he thinks he can recommend to his board, and then prorated that to the appropriate share between each of the localities. So that would result in a $3,730 savings to Lexington. And the city manager has been talking with the director of the regional library to see what they could do to reduce their budget by 10%. That would be almost a $16,000 savings. And then all those discretionary agency contributions, as discussed at last Thursday's meeting, a 10% reduction across the board would result in another $6,308 in savings. Now, originally in the budget, there was $27,000 included for the Virginia Program for Aging Services. And that was flat funding with last year, whereas their request had been 30,000. And in further reflection, realizing that those services they provide are kind of mandated services, and the funding to that agency is on a regional formula, and therefore it's not a discretionary agency. We realized that we really needed to put that in at the 30,000, not the 27, so it wouldn't be quite flat funding for them. Then we've asked all of our departments to take a look at ways that they could reduce their budget, and I might say that many of those departments, or most of those departments, had already reduced their budgets from last year, from the current year budget to the FY21 budget that was presented to you, including the city manager, who had made substantial cuts already in his budget. But many of those other departments likewise have reduced their non-salary budget. But the amounts that are listed here are cuts on top of those original reductions that were used to prepare the FY21 budget. So these are cuts over and above. So that gets us to a total expense cut of $966,573 in the general fund, whereas that revenue reduction up above was $955,000. So we offset all those anticipated revenue cuts and about an extra $11,000. Now, what other options might there be? And I'm sure the list the council may come up with is longer than the list we came up with. Janie, if you just scroll back up just a little bit more. Not quite that far. Thank you. One option, and not an option that we as staff recommend, council could consider eliminating the pay raise for the entire year. Another option, but again, not recommended, could eliminate the recycling collection program altogether. That would be savings of, if I remember correctly, in excess of $100,000. Okay, Janie, we're very good now to the next page.
Yeah, you know, on that recycling savings, is most of that in personnel, or it's in
yes,
operation?
Most all of that would be personnel, and so to achieve that savings, we would have to eliminate many positions. As already mentioned by council, we could eliminate that school resource officer position altogether, irrespective of whether we got approved for the grant or not. And realizing that there are likely to be other cuts to come, specifically the state's likely to reduce revenues passed back to the locality. There's always the option to use fund balance, and I'm sure there could be other options that maybe members of council come up with that we haven't listed, but those were some obvious ones to us that we wanted to at least list for the benefit of council. So if I may, in the interest of time, I'll move on to the school fund. They have revised their revenue budget to project the amounts that the state of Virginia is telling them that they'll get for the various categories of income from the state. That actually adds a little bit over $30,000 in income. Now, I know the question will be, how certain can we be of that income? And I think we would all recognize that probably the General Assembly is going to have to make some hard decisions when they reconvene later this month. But these are the latest numbers that we're getting from the state of Virginia. The schools have estimated that they can save $92,000 in the current fiscal year on operations. So rather than earmarking that for some capital use, capital projects, as we've been doing in the past, staff is recommending to council that we carry those surplus funds over and use to decrease the amount of funding needed from the general fund next year. They originally had projected in their expenditures a 5% increase in health insurance. That's only going to be 1.1%, so that saves almost $16,000. So between the combination of the increased state reimbursement, carrying over that $92,000 savings from this year and $16,000 savings health insurance, that allows us to reduce the local funding for next year, $138,000. So I'll pause to see if anybody has questions about school fund before I move on. Okay, hearing no questions, I'll move on to the utility fund. Certainly in fiscal year 20, with the students not being at VMI and Washington League, it would make sense that we're going to have less water consumed. But as we have less water consumed, our expenditures to the MSA hopefully should go down pretty significant amount. But for next year, we have nothing to indicate that students won't be back in school, so we're not making any assumption that there's going to be revenue changes in the utility fund. There would be some savings, although not a great deal, delaying that pay increase, the 3% pay increase that is, for 6 months, just as we saw up in the city portion. That saves a little bit over $6,200. And savings in health insurance, but offset, more than offset, our higher contribution rate to the retirement plan ends up costing an extra $1,700. So not a great deal of change in the utility fund. All total, less than, well less than $5,000 difference there. Okay, Janie, I'm ready for you to scroll on down.
Gary, I got
Equipment
a
replacement
question.
fund. Yes.
May I ask a quick question just about the MSA?
Yes.
Has the MSA shown any inclination similar to the way that tourism, similar to the way that potentially the library, to look at their own proposed costs, given that the budget that they approved, things have changed? I mean, I commend so many agencies for looking at their budgets, department heads looking at their budgets, because things have changed. And I just wondered if the MSA has shown that same spirit.
I'm not aware of any such action. Jim, are you aware of anything that I might not know about?
I am not aware of anything. I know they had adopted their budget previously. Of course, much of their budget is based on, expenses of operating the two plants. I could make an inquiry. That's all I could say at this point. I wouldn't count on a lot there.
Now, I appreciate that. I mean, I think that it's worth the inquiry. I appreciate it.
I think it would be only fair for me to point out that during their budget sessions that I attended, that didn't seem to be any more sympathetic to the impact on the localities and or our ratepayers than they were last year with the significant rate increase. And I don't think they're particularly sensitive to the concern that we have that they're planning double-digit increases for the next 3 years. I guess since Chuck Smith was at the same meetings, do you think, I hope I'm not misrepresenting, what was your impression, Chuck? Well, I'm not sure we still have Chuck.
Yeah, he's here.
Okay.
I would agree with the sentiment of what you just stated. Yeah, I guess the only thing I could think of that might be similar in principle would be to delay their staff pay increases till January 1st, similar to what Jim's proposing. If they could do that, I think it'd be a good gesture, but I wouldn't hang my hat on it.
Or since they're dominated and in sync usually with the county, and the county is not looking at any pay increases this year, they may revisit that. But to David's point and Jim's offer, it's certainly worth a question.
Yeah.
And I'll personally call Ned Reister and see where he is on the circumstances.
Great question, though, David. Okay, in the equipment replacement fund, we haven't recommended any reduction in the funding to that fund. We have discussed with our departments the possibility of delaying the purchase of a couple of vehicles, particularly the police and fire vehicles. Now, even though that would generate a savings next year in the equipment replacement fund, that just basically pushes the purchase out to the following year. And if we reduce the funding next year to account for that, then we've got to come up with extra funding the following year. And I would not recommend that to council because we need to continue to fund at the current rate if we hope to replace that ladder truck for the fire department, which is, right now we're looking at purchase third year out, and that ladder truck is well beyond its estimated useful life already. And if we curtail the funding to that fund, we're not going to have the estimated $1.3 million purchase that ladder truck when the current one dies or plays out. But we do have an option. We can delay purchasing some of those vehicles. In the capital projects fund, we are recommending.
Could I ask a quick question?
Yes.
On the equipment replacement fund, and speaking specifically to the ladder truck of the tune, what was that, 1.3 million?
That's the estimate I've heard thrown around by Todd Dickerson.
What's the contribution that VMI and WNL and or the hospital contribute to?
Right now, they do not contribute to the equipment replacement fund. I know that Noah Simon had some discussion with those three entities while he was here. None of us who are still here on staff are aware of any. We got the impression that there was positive discussion in that regard, but no agreements ever consummated and no dollar amounts promised.
Yeah,
but it would be nice if those entities would come to the table.
I guess that's a question worth asking. I know WNL and VMI, we're all sort of in the same boat, but in the spirit of coming together to keep our community safe and warm, maybe that is incentive to get the conversation going again. I know WNL, their endowment's going to get hit pretty hard. At least it has at the time being. In the long term, who knows? But I'd be in favor of getting those conversations started again, just so we get some information from those entities as to the level of interest and participation.
In addition to that, the longer you wait to purchase, the more it's going to cost.
Right. Yeah.
That would be true. Okay, any other comments before we move to the capital projects fund? we have made substantial changes here. We're recommending a decrease of transfers from the general fund in the amount of $310,000. We identified projects that we recommend taking out of next year's CIP. They're basically taken out, not delaying, in the amount of $300,000 that almost offsets that funding. And furthermore, with concurrence from Jeff Martone, we're recommending delay by 1 year the design and then the subsequent construction of the Ross Road Bridge repair of another approximately $100,000. Now you may wonder, well, if we're pushing $400,000 out of next year's CIP, can't we cut that funding by $400,000? And my response would be, when you delay that Ross Road Bridge repair, if we cut $400,000 out of funding this year, then we got to know that we've got to add an additional $100,000 next year. So I don't think that would be prudent to cut that funding further than what we've already cut it. So those are the summaries of the changes that we're recommending. And we provided to council, and Jenny, you may want to call up those budget summary worksheets now. We provided to council Excel spreadsheets that summarize all these changes. This particular report that you're looking at now summarizes all of the funds: general, school, utility, equipment replacement, capital projects. And I think what's particularly important, and I'm just now realizing that this was early. We've done so many iterations of these spreadsheets in the last week. I believe we've got a version that is not quite the latest, because our general fund numbers right now, the bottom line margin is 131,515, and on this spreadsheet that you're seeing is 113. We want that we need that bottom line to stay at least as close to 120,000 as we can. Why 120,000? Because 120,000 is the amount of the repayment from the utility fund to the general fund each year against the original loan of $1.2 million, which came out of unrestricted fund balance of the general fund. So as that loan is repaid, it's only proper to put that back into the fund balance where it came from. So with those cuts that we just went over on the summary, that bottom line, rather than it being 113,266, right now is 131,515. It's probably a good time to point out that since we've come up with this latest revision, we've got a few other small possible cuts that have been put on the table by department heads that are still under consideration, and we may well end up recommending even those additional small cuts as we go throughout these budget deliberations. Now, in the utility column, utility fund, the third column over, the reason that's a big negative is because we're spending a little bit over $4 million, or plan to spend a little bit over $4 million in capital outlay for water and sewer lines. So if it weren't for that, we'd actually have a positive number there. And all the additional sheets that you had in this packet give you further detail of each of those funds. There's a fund summary for each of the funds: general fund, utility, school, capital expenditure, equipment replacement. And then behind those, there's further detail on the revenues and expenditures in each of those funds. not going to bore you going through all those details, but we can address any questions that anybody may have had. And as we have those questions, then I'll try to direct Janie to the appropriate sheet. So that's what I have to present, Mr. Mayor. So I guess we're ready for questions and comments by council members.
Can you go back to the expenses? Because where you had the cuts by department, you had police, IT. What kind of cuts are those in those departments? I mean, you said you went over commissioner revenue. What about the IT and police and fire? Is that
okay? I've asked Jake. Jake's got the detail for me, so we're kind of division of labor. So I've asked him to be ready to address those specific questions for us.
Thank you.
So
Okay.
the majority of those cuts are really discretionary spending as far as training, travel, other sorts of similar expenses. You know, specifically speaking to the Commissioner of Revenue's office, there was a substantial cut in learning costs, again, with education, various goods, dues, and office supplies were the primary cuts in that department. With IT, his $7,500 cut comes from reducing the amount of replacement computers from 13, which was scheduled, to 5, and then an additional $2,000, which would represent the need for possibly a new network switch or other infrastructure equipment. Police, a lot of similar cuts as far as training, supplies, membership fees, etc. Another reduction in mailings and postage. So the common themes that we're seeing throughout each department is just discretionary spending as far as any sorts of training, travel, dues, anything that can be cut for the upcoming fiscal year.
And one big one in the fire department, they were hoping to have money to begin a program to do annual physicals for employees and volunteers. So the Chief Dickerson's recommended that we eliminate that from the budget. Fairly substantial reduction in training, I believe, and another fairly substantial reduction in durable goods. That is non-capitalized equipment.
Okay.
In finance, the biggest decrease there would be elimination of fees for an actuary. Right now, we have to have an actuary because of our other post-employment benefits, because we offer health insurance to retirees. We can get out from under that OPEB requirement if we no longer offer a blended rate to our retirees and make them pay whatever the cost should be for a retiree. But we have money in an OPEB trust that we can use to help soften that blow and increase premiums to those retirees. So we've got to work out the details, but we hope to get out from under that burden of OPEB reporting, which not only carries actuarial costs, but complicates the audit. There's a lot of reasons for getting out from under that obligation.
Jake, suffice to say, and Gary, these were brought by the department heads of things that they could live without next year if necessary, their contributions to making it through a tough time.
Yes, perhaps Jim would like to comment on that point, what he's asked of us as managers.
Well, I asked everybody to do what they could, and I think the response has been very, very good. As Gary mentioned earlier in the budget, almost every department looked at expenses they could cut before we submitted the budget to you and had made some cuts here and there. And they went back a second time and really cut, you know, I think Jake said discretionary, and yes, they're discretionary, but they're items that hurt. They do set them back in some respects. And, but they knew we had to do that to keep our priorities and fund our priorities.
Absolutely.
Which line item could possibly reflect the savings from the Chief Roman's position? Would that be in other wage and benefits?
Be up in other
Wages?
staffing savings.
Okay.
I believe we've currently got assumed two-month vacancy, July and August, and the fringe benefits that go with that.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, can I ask a question about, I guess the tourism 10%, the 29,095 on the main page. The proposal we're actually making for tourism is that tourism provide the localities a 10% refund or abatement on the next 5 quarters. So actually their April quarter, which falls in this year, would represent about a $7,000 savings to the city. But since we're making the proposal to tourism on, I guess my question is, would it be better for the city to recognize that 7,000 in savings in fiscal year 20 or fiscal year 21?
Well, I'm going to answer it this way, Dennis. Since the fourth quarter contribution comes out of this year's expenses, to the extent that we reduce that or they give us 10% of that back, I think the auditor is going to require us to accrue that back to the current fiscal year.
Okay. Just wanted to check.
And getting
so
back,
the 29,000 is for the 4 quarters next year.
Right. Okay.
it just, I mean, maybe I'm sure the math is right. It just doesn't seem, because tourism as a percentage gets a lot more money, I think. Then
Well,
Main Street Lexington gets 80. Tourism last year, I can't remember, but the 10%, that just, it seems like it would be more than 29.
Okay, I'm digging in my budget book.
Tourism, we put in about 36% of tourism budget. So if nothing had changed, next year we would have put in about $280,000.
Okay.
$5,000. And so 10% of that next year, well, you can see it there, 229,000 is 10% of $290,000, which is what we would be putting in to regional tourism budget.
The budget that we submitted to council, the contribution to tourism for next year, $290,948. So
Okay.
the number reflected in savings here is just 10% of what our obligation otherwise would be.
And, you know, just for reference, Rockbridge County's, they're 480,000, so they're going to get a $48,000 rebate.
Reduction from them.
Yeah, so it's a bigger reduction for them, and it's a, you know, I mean, I think for Buena Vista it would be about $4,800 next year.
So all told together, yeah. Okay. All right. Thanks.
Just to affirm, with this recommendation, you're recommending that we do not open up the outdoor pool at all this season.
That is correct. I spoke with the folks over at the Y, and at this point, they felt the same way. It just didn't make sense to try and open it and schedule it to be open with so much unknown.
Sure.
They have to start preparing to open the pool, put some costs and time effort into it. And even if we are somewhat out of the COVID-19 period, and I say somewhat because nobody knows, it doesn't make sense to leave ourselves and our community open to a possible risk when there may be some lingering impacts of COVID around for several months thereafter. It didn't seem to be a sensible thing for the Y or us.
Very good.
David, you had submitted a list of questions. I don't know how best to approach that, whether you want to ask your questions and us give response so that everyone that's tuned in can hear those answers? Or do you want me to read the questions to everyone and then give the answers? How do you want to handle that?
Whatever's easiest for you, Gary. I mean, I think you've answered my first one. We're going to continue to put the $120,000 back where it came from. We're not spending it this year. Do you want me to ask them?
That would be helpful.
Sure. Okay. So are we continuing with one digital and have we had a chance to renegotiate if we are?
Included in the original budget and unchanged in the revised budget is a fee of $20,000 for one digital, which is a reduction. That's $5,000 per quarter. Previously, it was $7,000 per quarter. So it is still in the budget, but at a reduced rate.
Excellent. Virginia First Cities, what about our expenditure to be a part of that group?
That membership fee is included in both the original and the revised budget. To date, we have no indication or reduction of the membership fees from them, although I believe that is something that the city manager has raised that point with him.
Great.
I don't mind telling you, with the assistance that we're getting and trying to quantify these revenue reductions, I think it's money well spent. I'm glad we're a member of Virginia First Cities now.
It's a wise decision.
I wonder if they're eligible for the Paycheck Protection Plan to cover several months of payroll as a nonprofit.
David, as
don't know.
As Gary said, I did make an inquiry to the director who I know, and I have not received a response, but I will follow up with conversation to see just what might be available to them and how they can help us.
Excellent, thanks. I had a question about the budget visualization tool that has been on our webpage for several years. I feel like I remember it costing initially $3,000 going back 2 to 3 years ago.
And the annual maintenance, if I remember correctly, was $1,800. They were proposing to go up to $2,400. Before we ever submitted the budget to council, Jim and I had agreed that that would be taken out of the budget, so it wasn't even included in your original proposal.
Thank you. And this is hard. You know, I had a question about our public schools, and of course the CARES Act has significant money. Virginia's going to get $3 billion for K through 12, and it hasn't been, you know, appropriated yet to the schools. And so I guess I'm sure we are tracking it, and when we have more information, it'll be plugged into the budget. But it concerns me that so much of our budget is built around our schools, and you know, the legislature doesn't reconvene until the 22nd of April, and our timeline has us basically approving the budget soon thereafter, having about, you know, a week to digest things or so. And so I don't expect an answer on that. It's just, I think that we
actually, I have an answer for you. And so that we won't lose anything in interpretation, I'm simply going to read the answers to your two questions from the superintendent.
Perfect.
For your first question about are they monitoring what's going on in Richmond, or I'm paraphrasing that question. The answer is we're monitoring Richmond and the potential changes to the state budget as of yesterday's biweekly conference call, and she wrote this yesterday at 6:56 p.m. So this would have been as of Tuesday's biweekly conference call with Virginia Department of Education. The state superintendent shared with superintendents that all new spending is on hold with regards to the FY21 budget, including salary increases, re-benchmarking, etc. Of course, Governor Northam announced yesterday that the decision on whether to give teachers and other state workers raises is being pushed back. We're waiting to hear more, and Tommy and I, that would be Tommy Roberts, and I will begin the preliminary work on the budget amendments in anticipation of cuts from the state fund. And then in regards to your question number 6, having to do with these federal funds flowing back to the state, our answer is, according to Governor Northam and the state superintendent, Virginia is anticipating $240 million from the CARES Act, plus an additional $65 million for the governor's discretionary fund. Allocations to schools are supposed to be based on our share of Title I funding, which is based on our percentage of students who qualify for free and reduced meals programs. Our school division has a relatively low percentage of students who qualify for these services. Thus, our Title I funds are not significant. Nonetheless, we will be told how much money we may receive and how we may use it. I've been told that funds may be used to support expenses directly to COVID-19, and to date, we have not identified any additional expenses directly related to COVID-19 and school closure. As I know more, we will continue to monitor the situation. So it sounds like they're definitely keeping track of what's going on in Richmond.
And then, you know, I had the question basically on the Paycheck Protection Plan, and, you know, we're funding with a little bit of our tax dollars, a whole lot of nonprofits, and just wondering if they're trying to tap into those dollars, if they're eligible to. You know, I listed in my question, you know, I mean, Yellow Brick Road and RARA, I mean, can the YMCA be tapping into those dollars? I mean, you know, as we cut potentially 10%, you know, are they able to qualify for 2 months of payroll and utilities and so on?
My understanding is nonprofits, yeah, they can access the PPP. There's also the EIDL, I think it's called, another source of emergency funding open to nonprofits. As I said in my email, the Rockbridge Area Health Center submitted a PPP. You know, you have to act fast. I hope people don't think, you know, you sit around. They need executive directors of organizations need to just fill out the application. It's not that hard, and submit it, because it's a first come, first serve basis. So we submitted ours on Monday, and now I'm going to be looking at the EIDL one too. So the money's out there. We just have to, I'd be curious to know what nonprofits are accessing or trying to access these PPP funds.
I think it's, you know, it's hard for us to, we don't want to get into the business of,
right. But
yeah, exactly, nonprofits with their boards, but, you know, we also are appropriating taxpayer dollars to the nonprofits that we believe in, and it's just, I just certainly hope that the nonprofits are doing all they can to help themselves, because the process that you described, Michelle, it is challenging for some nonprofits, this bidding of the materials, and you have to have a bank that's willing to work with you or return your phone calls or help you.
Yeah.
But, you know, as we potentially cut some of our nonprofits 10% or more, if they're able to get 2 months of their expenditures covered, that will help them and help all of the city of Lexington and Rockbridge County and Buena Vista. So.
And same with some of the other businesses. It's not just the nonprofits. So a lot of the small, I think the MSL has been working with businesses, I believe, helping.
Oh, certainly. Oh, there are many businesses doing it, but I'm just talking about the group, the ones that we are potentially cutting. And if we cut Yellow Brick Road, who a couple of years ago we said we were going to cut them down to 0. I think that was 5 years ago when we said we were going to do that, yet they're still in the budget. If we cut them $250, are they able to get 2 months of payroll for however many 20 employees that they have, and therefore the $250 that we save, are they okay? Is, you know, some of the other nonprofits. That's all. I hope that they are pursuing, that all of our nonprofits are pursuing those dollars.
Yeah. Mhm.
David, you had a couple more questions? Or at least
Well,
one?
I had a question. Just, each year for the last few years, we've provided a small, gift or benefit to staff around the holidays, and I wondered if that was still in the budget.
Okay, David, I'm going to dig for my detail on the HR budget.
Janie, while he's searching, could you scroll back up to the top of the document? Thank you.
David, I believe that those monies are still in the HR budget.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Gary.
Let us know if you learn differently.
I don't see anything that indicates that that's been cut at any point.
What other questions do members of council have about the recommendations that staff has brought forward this afternoon?
I just have a
It's really good.
cool.
Thank you for all the work you've done on this as a group. I do think we should, at some point, whether it's now or later, talk about, is that SRO position a priority?
Yeah.
Well, if I may comment, in talking to both Rebecca Walters at the school and Chief Roman and now Mark Riley, those two departments, the schools and the police department, thinks it's a very high priority, very useful in our community. They've seen what it does in other communities and believe it really is helpful with helping a certain population of our young people be more successful in school and have a better educational experience. The other item I think that's important is there was some discussion, can we put it off for later? From what I understand, this is the third time we've applied for the grant. We may have actually received it in one of the past 2 years and turned it down. And so Chief Roman, I know, and is particularly concerned that if we were to turn it down a third time, there will be no fourth time. They're not going to continue to waste time on Lexington if we don't want to do this project. And maybe we don't, but I'm just saying that if it's a priority at all, it seems like we ought to try and keep it in the budget. And if it's not, obviously we could cut it out, but I will say the schools and the PD feel it's very, very helpful.
And does everybody feel like our IT?
Before you jump to IT, Leslie, let's, if anybody wants to make a comment on the SRO position.
I'll be quick. At the VML meeting in can y'all hear me? I don't. Yeah.
Yeah, hear you. Mhm.
At the VML meeting in Richmond, I sat next to one of the Virginia First Cities board members, and now I can't recall her name, but as to what she did in Norfolk, and she's an educator. She helps teachers with their instruction and education skills. And I asked her about SROs, and she said, yeah, at their middle schools, very similar to, I would say, maybe a similar situation at Maury River, where you have a much larger population, maybe a much more diverse population. The value of an SRO is there. And I asked her about elementary, and it was something along the lines, yeah, it's really not needed at the elementary level. It's much more needed as the kids get older, like middle school and definitely at the high school. So just sharing those thoughts of what another educator had from a much larger school district.
I would just chime in and say that I look at it as a luxury of sorts for our school system the 180 students at Liburn Downing and 320 at Waddell. I may have my numbers off a little bit, but if we weren't staring down close to $1 million+ deficit for next year, there are a lot of things I think that we should be doing in the city instead of an SRO. So I would support not taking it out. I think this is our second request for the grant money. And I think you're right, Jim. The money is drying up fast for SROs, which is why it's a match as opposed to fully funded for the deal that was before. So my position, I no disrespect. I think the research that the school board did and the superintendent and the police department, it's a wonderful program, given the size of our community, the level of crime or lack thereof. It's not a pound on the table, we need it now circumstance. It's my position. Ms. Alexander.
Yeah, I was just going to say that you don't realize you need it till you need it and wish you had it. I mean, every school is vulnerable to things that come up. So I would like to see it left in the budget for the sake of our schools. Even though we have a small population, I don't think that the need for an SRO has anything to do with the population of the school. Is that you have two schools that are vulnerable just like any other.
I might make it.
Your concerns, Leslie, and I mean, I was never fully on board with it in the beginning, but we did we had a joint meeting with the school board and we blessed it. And I felt like since we did commit, gave the superintendent, school board the go ahead, and then they submitted the grant, I think it's hard to back out of it now, to reject it if we get awarded that grant. I just feel like we really can't do that.
Well, I was in favor of it before because they did do the research, they went through the process, and we've always had a partnership between the police department and the schools. This is more formalizing it. But you know, when we had those discussions, Frank made the comment, if we go in, you have to be careful with this position, because if you go into a recession, that's one of the primary positions that's a target to be cut. Yeah. And I think that's exactly where we're at right now. That I never felt like it was a strong priority. If we could retain the relationship we've always had between the police and the schools. Mm-hmm. If we can continue that, you might not have someone there all day, but as long as you have police dropping in and out, I just question that, and I keep bringing up IT because I question now, you know, is that really our priority, or are we better off preparing for any kind of emergency situation by making sure all of our students have access to Wi-Fi, whether it's hotspots or they already have it in their house, and do they have access to a tablet of some type so you can do distance learning, whether it's a, you know, this pandemic or a weather situation, an earthquake like Louisa had, and they were out of school for months. I just kind of reorganizing priorities.
I personally have been struggling with this one too. I know there's a lot of people who really want this, but like Frank and Leslie, I feel like there might be other priorities that might be more important. And the fact that the matching grant has shrunk and it's now just a $24,000 savings, actually in a way that makes it easier to not go forward with it. Because if we really need to do this later, we can. My concern with just having one school resource officer serving two schools is I'm not sure it provides the protection that maybe we're looking for. And I don't know. I would prefer to delay on that. I think that would be my preference.
I asked a question a while back. I think that, and it was explained to me that I may have been looking at it incorrectly if I was under the impression that the reason for the SRO was to provide protection. Because I asked a question and I said, how many times in the last 5 years has 911 been called by one of our schools because there was an emergency? And, I said, how many times in the last 5 years I asked some other pointed questions, and the answers I got was, that's not the reason for the SRO. But that being said, just like it would be easy for city council to say to our finance director and our city manager, we can't afford the 3% raise come January. That's given what we're staring down, our city manager believes it's incredibly important. And so I want to do all I can to try to take one of his priorities and leave it in the budget that he believes we need. Our superintendent is also aware of the budget situation. And I gather that over the next few weeks, things are going to change in Richmond. And potentially this conversation, we're going to look back on it and say, all the money went away, anyway. And so our superintendent might have to make some hard decisions on her own. As of right now, if it continues to be a priority of our school board and our superintendent, while personally, I don't have all the research and my own thoughts are what they are, I'm going to have to side with our superintendent and our school board, because I have a feeling that Richmond's going to make some decisions for us, and we're going to be forced to say, do we do raises for teachers or do we have SRO? What are we doing? Because the raises that Richmond currently is proposing for teachers, it's going to be hard. I mean, things are going to be really, really hard anyway. So I'm fine leaving it there for now because it may go away at the recommendation later.
Thank you, David. Looking at the screen before us, Fund 1, General Fund revenues. Everybody, I think those have been explained. Everybody's okay with those. We've talked about the SRO, but anything else in that list for revenues that anybody has any questions on? And Janie, if you can scroll down a little bit, as we look at expenses, are there any questions or specific issues? I'll just point out, Gary, you indicated the contingency fund was eliminated, but on that final document, you said that 113 figure that's in front of us is actually 131, and that 11 could be our contingency fund if we wanted to.
Yes, that is correct statement. I'm sorry I didn't point that out clearly like I intended to when we got to that summary.
Gary and I discussed that, and as he said also, there are a few other savings that came in from departments after Gary and Jake had to finalize this to get it in your hands.
Right.
So it's probably on the order of maybe closer to 20,000 even. And I would recommend at this point in time that be considered a contingency, because to be honest with each of you, asking these department heads to make these cuts without a lot of time to review it, there are probably a few things that might have not been considered or left out or overlooked. And we might need a few dollars here and there to put back into some of these budgets in the next 12 months after the budget's passed, because they said, gosh, Jim, I cut 4,000 out of this line and I thought we could make it, or it looked like that was enough, but it's not. And I need X to buy another small piece of equipment. So I think it would be wise to leave it while we can. To David's point, in about a week and a half or two, when the General Assembly comes in, the other recommendations we had, SRO, the raise, the recycling, and several others might be off the table and we'll be into reserves. But for now, this is all we know.
Any members of council have questions on the expenses as they're proposed?
Just on, I had one on Jim on the Berkeley group. So that amount does include that we finished the comprehensive plan.
Yes, it does.
Okay.
And going back to the outdoor pool and closing that for the summer, wouldn't there be some maintenance costs for maintaining the pool even though it's closed?
That's correct, and we took that into account. those
Yeah,
costs.
Marilyn, I just quite frankly don't know how to quantify that because if we close it for the summer, we can't totally eliminate the chemicals.
Right.
There's going to have to be some chemicals used. We're going to have to continue to pump the water. How much the electrical savings will be, I
Right.
don't know. Now, as far as the repair and maintenance, I would advocate that we not think about cutting that because that is for things like when a pump goes bad or water recirculators, that's or chemical feeders. You know, we're going to have to continue to, unless we just totally drain that pool. I don't think we want, and I'm going to use a vernacular term, we don't want green water over there. So
That's what'll
we're going to
happen.
have to continue to treat it with chemicals, and we better have pumps in good operating order. So I doubt that we'll save anything significant on repairs and maintenance, but
Yeah. I just wanted to make sure that there was money for that.
Currently, we do not drain the pool at the end of the season.
we do not, because for a couple of reasons. First of all, the cost to refill the pool with water is rather significant. And if you don't continue to keep water in the pool, then you've got more of a cleaning cost to get leaves and debris, et cetera, out of there. And you spend or I'm told that you spend a lot more in chemical costs trying to get it up and ready for when you do operate the pool. So
Exactly.
Also, keep in consideration the water actually is part of the pool structure. If you drain all the water out, then all the pressure that the water puts on the walls is now gone. Now you have pressure from the earth that can potentially cause some structural issues if you don't have the water in there.
Gotcha.
And if you got a crack in that pool and had to repair that, would imagine that far outstrip any of the savings that we might realize otherwise.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Jim and Gary, do the revenues include a cigarette tax increase?
No, and quite frankly, don't know how we would begin to quantify that. And as Jim and I talked about that, because we don't think it would be a huge amount of money, and because we really don't have any basis to know how many packs of cigarettes are sold in the locality, assuming that council should enact such a tax, it would be our recommendation that you just let that be extra revenue that helps you make up for any other shortfalls that aren't currently being anticipated. Jim, you may want to say more about that issue.
Well, Gary's right. We did discuss that in some detail without knowing what it would deliver for us in revenues. And it's seemingly not major. It would just probably be best to consider it something to cushion some of the other blows that might fall in the year ahead. The other thing I wanted to mention is that in talking with Spencer, the county is planning on going forward. Now, they cannot actually, I say they, but counties in general will not be able to enact this tax until July 1st of 2021, which does not mean we could not do it sooner, but it probably makes sense to at least consider doing it proximate to what the county does, potentially, so that we're having that conversation as a community and working on that as a community, not just here in Lexington.
Well, if we did it sooner than the county, people would just go to the county and get their cigarettes. So
Some portion of people would, obviously, yes. Councilmember Smith and I were talking about that, or exchanging a few emails. And, if you get a person who's a pack a day person, it's 20 cents a pack. Now, for 20 cents, is somebody going to do that? I don't know. And I don't smoke, but I hear a pack a day is quite a smoking habit. Most people smoke maybe a lot less. I don't know.
Very good. Thank you for the
Can I ask
question.
a question about our expenses? I've always appreciated in recent years the accuracy that the city has approached the jail budget with, and for the potential for costs and so on, to try to avoid surprises or unrealistic expenses. With the jail budget, do we continue to budget as accurately as we believe that we should be budgeting?
The number that's shown here for the savings is predicated upon the most recent number given to us by the jail subsequent to their meeting earlier this week. And Jim was present at that meeting and might want to make more comments.
Well, in this environment that we're in, I can say that myself and Spencer and Jay and the other board members are watching this very carefully to make sure these numbers are as accurate as we can make them at that level. One of the other things that, that may be beneficial about what we're facing right now is, I will say, we're working much more closely with the entire criminal justice system to look at alternatives to putting people in jail. Home electronic monitoring, we're already putting that in place at a much greater rate than we were before. So there are hopefully some of those folks we can avoid putting in jail. They shouldn't really be there, but we really haven't followed up on those alternatives the way we should have prior to this.
Sounds good. And again, I will say, just in recent years, I appreciate the honesty that Gary always had about the costs at the jail and good budgeting practice that we've done as a city for those expenses. So sounds good. Thank you.
I don't want to overlook the council member Strawn's question about IT, especially as it relates to the schools. Councilmember Smith had asked me a question about what's the big jump in the IT line in the school. And one of the answers I got from Nathan, who's our IT guy, is that they are now going to one-to-one in the schools with computers. Every child will have a computer. Before, there was a pool of computers that the kids shared on a daily basis or from class to class. Now, apparently, they're going to either have that in place or working on getting in place that every child has access to a computer. So I think that's a step in the right direction. And again, talking with Nathan, the small cuts we did make in the IT budget, he did not see that as greatly diminishing our capacity in the IT area at all. We have a schedule for replacing computers. No particular need or concern that there are so many of them failing. Many of them can work well beyond the time frame that they would ultimately be replaced. So we didn't see that we were weakening our infrastructure and computers based on those small cuts.
Leslie, do I remember correctly with the school budget that there was specific for IT and equipment? There was a line item usually came from the state. It may have been lottery dollars or something.
Yeah, right.
It's $102,000 technology grant they normally receive each year.
Right. They'll buy a lot of laptops, I would think, or a lot of tablets.
And then having the resources, which I believe was in their budget, because they'll need the resource people to help teachers learn how to use the equipment properly and to maintain all of the equipment.
And the students.
Right.
The students can show the teachers.
Well, we did fully fund the school budget. There were no cuts to the budget to speak of. So whatever they requested, it's still there.
That's a long tradition we've had for many decades. So thank you all for doing that. And I know the school board is always very responsible with their ask. Gary, I have a question that may not sound, I'm still trying to figure out how to make it. The governor in his budget had committed, I think, what was it, a 5% raise for teachers? And so much of it was supposed to be from the state and so much of it from the locality?
It was a 4% over the 2-year biennium budget.
Okay.
In the state's budget, it was 2% extra reimbursement for FY21, meaning that if we give a 2% pay raise, then we would be eligible for that increased reimbursement from the state. To get the second 2%, you'd have to give an additional 2%, at least a 2% raise the following year.
Right, and so that's a bit of a match piece. If the state goes back on that and doesn't fund it, and we still do our anticipated increase,
it'll increase the local funding requirement.
Okay. So we just need to be aware of that. If we eliminated the local, the match from the state, if the state abandons it, not to foul our teachers, but I think we need to, I guess, I want to make sure I understand if the raise that we're proposing this year is really in response to the governor and matching funds. We can still do our part, but we'll have to pay for all of it.
And that was kind of my thought, that again, it's about priorities. And after Richmond takes their action, and if we don't have their assistance for raises for teachers, if we still desire to do raises for teachers, the money would have to come from somewhere else. And that's up to them. They know their area better than we do. And that's why why I approached the SRO the way that I did. I'll let them make the hard decisions when they're forced to make them in a few weeks.
So the SRO, is that coming out of the police budget now?
It's part of the police budget now.
Yes.
It's not school budget.
Right.
My bad.
Right. Of course, those dollars can be sent to the schools should we need them. But, you know, the reality is if we see some significant cuts come from the state, which we could, both in the school budget and in the general fund budget, we're going to have to make up the majority of that in the reserve funding. You know, we're going to have to dip into the reserves. The SRO position, the $70-some thousand for doing away with the raise entirely, those things won't close that gap. Now, we're talking a gap that's going to be hundreds of thousands of dollars, would be my guess, if the state delivers that. Now, they might go into their rainy day fund. They might get enough federal funds to make that gap not what it could be. I don't know.
Jim, from conversations we had before, dipping into the general fund is one option. Cutting additional expenses, i.e. services and or personnel, is another. Not the route we want to go, but all things on the table, depending upon what the state does. We just need to be prepared.
Sure, of course, everything on the table. But as I've said before, and I will say this now again, is that, you know, we have a rainy day fund for the rainy day, and this is the day. And we hurt ourselves and our community if we don't use it for the intended purpose, and we do let our services degrade, our personnel degrade, and the quality of life that we have built over the years in the community, if we let that degrade when we otherwise would not have to. In the good years, we can replenish the rainy day fund, the reserves, but you probably, as you know, you hardly catch up ever with that degraded infrastructure, degraded personnel, degraded other things, because the costs of everything continues to go up and there are other needs, and it takes decades to catch up if you get behind.
If you ever do catch up, it's a perhaps new normal, but your point is extremely well taken, and I'm optimistic that the state will do better by Virginians and certainly by our educators specifically from that standpoint. But going back, any council have any other questions on what's been presented this evening, or any objections that haven't already been discussed?
I just have a question about the reduced agency funding, the tourism, Main Street, and whatever. With those 10% reductions, do you know if this is going to mean eliminating positions?
In tourism, it was, in Dennis can speak to this, but it was my understanding that that was not the case. In the library, when I spoke with the library director and her board chair, there would probably be some hours cut, because obviously the greatest portion of their expense is the hours they're open, you know, 6 days a week, etc. But I don't believe, or I didn't hear at that discussion, that there would be jobs lost.
Okay.
There might be part-time hours in particular cut, and maybe even some full-time hours reduced. I don't know. She hasn't obviously put that plan in place yet.
Okay.
The Main Street will be hurt because Rockler Bridge, their biggest fundraiser, has been canceled. You know, their fundraising efforts are not going to contribute to the budget this year. So
They're definitely going to have some tough challenges.
Along those lines, has there been discussion at Main Street of rescheduling Rock the Bridge for a fall date, or is just scrapped until?
Yeah, to tell you the truth,
21?
I haven't heard. Yeah.
Because I don't know how to get this programmed, but I think once, I'm crossing my fingers in the fall and most of this is behind us. That would present a fantastic opportunity for Main Street to do something similar to Rock the Bridge to celebrate, Main Street plugged back in and life returning to as much normal as possible.
Yeah, you hear a lot of people talking about having cabin fever and being happy when this is over and going out in the middle of the street and jumping for joy. And that would be the opportunity.
Absolutely. Several fundraisers, like the YMCA's golf tournament was going to be, I think, in late April. They've moved it to August, hoping that it'll still happen. So as Chuck indicated, take back to Main Street Lexington. We hope that they'll find a time to reschedule, certainly to fill that hole, but of their budget, but more importantly, to give the community an opportunity to celebrate and enjoy the great outdoors and our great downtown.
Do any of our funding formulas or memorandums of understanding need reviewed for any of these cuts? For example, I mean, do we need to look at the tourism one for the change that we might make? Do we need to look at Main Street Lexington because it calls for them to fundraise in order to access our money? And if you mentioned that Rock the Bridge is one of their huge fundraisers, and if it's not occurring, does that impact the funding formula for them to tap into the city dollars? I just don't know if any of them need to be looked at about that.
My sense is that we certainly could look at those agreements. When it comes to tourism, it was voluntary. RARO was voluntary. Again, they put forth these requests or proposals of how they could help all of our local government agencies, the county and the two cities. The same was true from the library. When I spoke with the library director, she said, it would be easier for us if you gave us a number. And I said, well, I've heard 10%. And she said, if that's what it had to be, we'd make it work at 10%. Main Street, again, I've asked Rebecca, she came back just today with some cuts. I haven't had a chance to evaluate or analyze those to see what they would produce. If we're working at this more or less voluntarily, I'm not sure going through like the legalism of reviewing the agreements is helpful at this point.
No, I completely agree. But if you remember Main Street Lexington's agreement, for them to access our funds, they have to fundraise a certain amount. And all the other ones I get that are jointly funded and so on, if they submit a budget that is less, then we just have less to fund. Main Street is a little bit different, that has a required fundraising component. Again, I'll let you all worry about that, but I just bring it up because we've dealt with that here recently in the last year or so.
I appreciate that. I'm just thinking of the times we're in, they face a difficulty just as much as we do. And if we want to maintain them so they can help sustain our downtown, we might vary from that formula a little bit, or that formulatic approach, and just come to an agreement between community partners and say, we accept what you've been able to fundraise, they accept what we're able to provide them in the budget, and we're going to go about making the community as strong as we can together.
Right, and that's 110% what I'm trying to convey.
Okay.
The legal document, we should just confirm that we're going to deviate from it, that I'm 110% in support of doing. But some people read contracts, and we should be sure that what we're doing and that they know what they're doing. That's all.
Okay, thank you.
The memorandum of understanding certainly is so everybody understands the rules of engagement, and things have changed. We should perhaps affectionately title this budget the COVID-19 budget. But in all seriousness, just reviewing that so that they're not penalized or a gotcha situation, that they're fulfilling the requirements that are in that memorandum of understanding.
Sure.
Keep us all in tune so we don't have any gotcha
Right.
Circumstances from that standpoint.
Agreed. Thank you.
I'm going to sit, or I guess ask again, are there any objections to moving forward with what's been presented here tonight? We're not voting, of course. We're going to look at this again next Thursday, but this is the next step in the process. And any grave concerns or anxieties? I know there's a truckload of praise for staff and for all those involved, drilling down, trying to figure out the dollars and cents, whether it's 10% or voluntary or how it's come about, but to achieve what Gary, Jake, and Jim have put together for us to consider is terrific work. But I'll go back. Does anyone have any objections or anxieties to moving forward with what's been presented?
A lot of anxiety, but we have no choice.
Well, and it remains to be seen what the state does, which is the wild card as usual. And Lord only knows what their projections are looking like from that standpoint. All we can hope for is a bright mind finding a cure for the virus so we can all get back to hugging and shaking hands and dancing in the streets and jumping for joy, as you say. Is there anything else or any issues council members wanted to bring forward during this budget discussion? If not, Gary, Jim, Jake, anything you want to add or need any direction from us?
I would like to take a point of personal privilege, if I may. It's been a busy time over the last week, but I tell you what, I'm convinced the city is going to be in good hands with Jake on board. I couldn't have asked for a better team member to work with me throughout this process, and it's been a pleasure not only working with him, but I appreciate the approach that Jim's had in all this too. It's not the sort of situation you want to come into as a new city manager, but I'm proud to be a part of this team, and I'm quite convinced that y'all are going to be in good hands going forward.
Gary, thank you. And it goes without saying a deep gratitude for you voluntarily offering to stay to get us through this mayhem and to help in the selection of Jake and moving forward. So thanks for, I always say that the only time you can leave is when you find your replacement. And you've done a great job with that and look forward to Jake's good work moving forward. But thank you very, very much. Anything else for the good of the cause or concerns?
No, this meeting format worked out really well. So is this for now what we're planning on doing next Thursday?
I would say yes. We'll plan to Zoom from whatever locations are comfortable for you. I'm curious if we can, or how we work it. Be interested to see letting the public in. How we can accomplish that and still work this way.
And does Janie have the ability to mute?
Yeah.
Yes, I do.
You can also like raise your hand, right? If you're open it to the public, there's like a feature.
There's also a waiting room, I think, Jamie, where you
something, or a chat. Maybe you can utilize the chat.
There is, and if I could have gotten it to go to Facebook Live for this meeting, people can also comment there. I know the last time we did this, I was able to get it to go live.
Right.
And people could comment on that as well. So there's different avenues. I have been advised by IT to not share our Zoom information with anybody and everybody.
Right.
It does pose a risk.
Yeah.
So there are other avenues of getting public comment, and I'm talking to other colleagues of mine and seeing what they're doing in other localities on how to get the most out of the public that we can during this.
And be able to allow them to attend of sorts, or view it if nothing else.
We can always read their, I mean, they can always submit a public comment and we can read it, I guess. You know.
Sure.
Do that.
Well, thank you, Janie, because this has worked out
Thank
great.
Yeah. Everybody see that Zoom chat?
There you go.
Yeah.
We all understand your pain. Is that right, Frank?
Exactly. Exactly. Part of the budget. If there is nothing else to come before us this evening, I would say thank you very much to everyone involved. Great work to Janie and staff for making all the electronics work, and I hope everybody has a great night and a super holiday.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Night night.